The Basement of Shadows. It was the kind of house everyone avoided, the last one on a dead-end street, old and leaning, with broken windows and creeping ivy. Recently inherited, James and Sarah moved into it from the city, eager for a fresh start. They had little idea what lay beneath its floors, the dark, forgotten basement, hidden behind a locked door. As they explored the house, Sarah noticed an oddity, a heavy wooden door with strange symbols carved into the frame. "I thought the realtor said the basement was sealed up," she murmured. But there it was, waiting. Their curiosity overcame their hesitation. James found the key, buried deep in a drawer, tarnished but unmistakably designed for that ominous door. As the lock turned, the creak echoed, and the door groaned open, revealing steps leading into thick darkness. Stepping down, they felt an unnatural chill. The basement was unexpectedly large, stretching further than the house above. It was empty, except for an old chair and dust-covered jars lined up along one wall. The air grew colder as they descended, almost suffocating. A strange odor lingered, like something decaying deep within the walls. Suddenly the door slammed shut above them, and the lights flickered. Their flashlights cast elongated shadows, giving the impression that they were not alone. That night, strange things began to happen. They would hear faint whispers, soft footsteps echoing from the basement when they were upstairs. Doors creaked open on their own, and objects went missing, only to reappear in odd places. Sarah noticed scratches on her arms and legs, even though she hadn't been outside. Both started having nightmares, visions of people with hollowed eyes whispering to them in languages they didn't understand. A week later, James found an old newspaper clipping shoved under the door. It detailed a family who had vanished decades ago, the house's former residents. Only one body was ever found, at the very bottom of the basement. The article mentioned neighbors hearing screams for days before the family disappeared. One evening, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. "I want to leave, James. We should have never come here." But they were bound to the house by financial struggles and a sense of obligation. James felt the house had chosen them. Every time they tried to leave, the car wouldn't start, or the doors would jam, as if the house itself held them captive. After a particularly terrible nightmare, Sarah awoke to find herself lying in the basement, cold concrete beneath her. James heard her screams and rushed down, only to see her with blank, vacant eyes, muttering, "They want me. They want us." That night, as they tried to get some sleep, a hollow knocking came from the basement door, a relentless beat, drawing them back down. This time, Sarah resisted, but James felt compelled to return. It was as if something below was calling him, whispering secrets only he could hear. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw them, shadows moving within shadows, dozens of them, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They moved closer, whispering his name. "James, join us." Paralyzed, he heard Sarah scream from above as the basement door slammed shut, trapping him. In that moment, he realized the shadows weren't just shadows. They were spirits, angry, lost souls who had died within the walls of that house, their bones still hidden, waiting for someone to finally set them free. Days passed, and Sarah, frantic, tried everything to open the basement door. She could still hear James's voice, faint but desperate, calling her name from below. The smell of decay grew stronger, as if something ancient and rotten was seeping through the very wood and stone of the house. One night, as she drifted between sleep and wakefulness, she heard a whisper by her ear, a voice that was not James's. "If you want him back, come down." Desperate, she returned to the basement, only to find the walls covered in names scratched into the stone. There, in the center of the room, James sat motionless, staring ahead, hollow-eyed and ghostly pale. When he looked at her, she saw that he was not alone in his body. His eyes reflected dozens of other souls, trapped, looking for escape. The whispers grew, filling the basement, urging her to join them, to stay forever. But in a surge of terror and determination, Sarah dragged James up the stairs, feeling hands and cold touches grasping at her, pulling them back. They escaped, barely, but were never the same. James, hollow and broken, didn't speak of what he saw, and Sarah knew she would never sleep without hearing those whispers echoing in her mind. They abandoned the house, but sometimes, in her dreams, Sarah is back in the basement, with shadows closing in, voices calling her name. The unraveling days. After abandoning the house, James and Sarah tried to rebuild their lives, but the horror they'd left behind seemed determined to follow them. James became withdrawn, spending long hours staring blankly at walls, mumbling incoherent phrases, his eyes empty, lost. Occasionally, he would mutter about the others, about their cries for freedom, for release. Sarah feared he was losing his mind. One night, she found him standing in the middle of their new bedroom, eyes fixed on a dark corner, as if someone or something was there. His lips moved soundlessly, and he kept repeating the word, release. Terrified, but desperate to help him, Sarah began digging into the house's history. She discovered that the house had been owned by a man named Elias Grayson, rumored to have been a twisted occultist in the late 1800s. Neighbors had whispered about strange gatherings in the dead of night, about rituals in the basement and screams that were carried off by the wind. Then suddenly, Grayson and his followers vanished, leaving only the empty house behind. Driven by a need for closure, Sarah found an old journal belonging to Grayson. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to binding souls and sacrifices to the darkness. One entry, dated shortly before his disappearance, read, "The ritual is nearly complete. Soon I will have all that I need. Their souls will be bound eternally, forever slaves to the darkness below." The pieces began to fall into place. The souls trapped in the basement weren't just people who had died there. They were intentionally bound, prisoners forced to serve some dark purpose. And by disturbing the basement, Sarah and James had somehow reopened that terrible wound. Sarah confronted James with the truth, but his eyes were vacant, his mind fractured. He whispered, "They want us to finish it, to free them." He insisted they return to the house, that only then would the voices stop. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. Armed with knowledge from Grayson's journal, they returned to the house in the dead of night. The basement door seemed to pull them in, as though the house itself had been waiting. Descending into the darkness, they were greeted by the familiar chill, the shadows, and the faint whispers that grew louder with each step. Following the journal's instructions, they arranged candles in a circle and prepared to recite the incantation to release the trapped souls. But as they began, the room shifted, the walls seeming to stretch and contract, as if the basement itself were breathing. Shadows moved independently, faces materializing out of the darkness, faces of men, women, children, all of them hollow-eyed, their mouths open in silent screams. A voice, low and menacing, echoed through the room. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was Grayson himself. "You have trespassed where you do not belong." As Sarah chanted the incantation, Grayson's voice grew louder, battling her words. The shadows drew closer, pressing in around them, suffocating them. James began to convulse, screaming that they were tearing him apart from the inside. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as if trying to stop the voices. In a moment of clarity, Sarah realized that the ritual wasn't meant to free the souls. It was a trap, designed to claim the lives of anyone foolish enough to perform it. Grayson had tricked them, luring them into completing his dark work. With a desperate scream, Sarah broke the circle, snuffing out the candles. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, all was silent. But then, one by one, the shadows advanced. She could feel them pressing against her, cold and oppressive, as if they were draining her very life. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah called out to the spirits, begging them to help her stop Grayson. She held up the journal, tearing pages from it, reciting passages she could barely understand. As she spoke, the shadows recoiled, and for a moment, she saw Grayson himself, a tall, skeletal figure, his eyes burning with hatred. "You cannot undo what has been done," he snarled, but his form began to waver as Sarah tore through the final pages. The spirits, empowered by her defiance, began to pull at Grayson, tearing him away from his hold on the basement. With a final, blood-curdling scream, Grayson dissolved into the darkness, the shadows collapsing around him. The room fell silent, and Sarah could feel a weight lifting, as if a shroud had been removed. James lay unconscious, his face finally peaceful. When he awoke, he remembered nothing, the horrors erased from his mind. But Sarah knew the truth, knew that the souls of those trapped in the basement were finally free. The House of Shadows. They left the house for good, yet the memories lingered. Sometimes, Sarah would feel a chill at her back, or catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of her eye. She would hear Grayson's voice in her dreams, whispering that some things are meant to remain hidden, that darkness is forever patient, waiting for someone to be curious enough to seek it out. Years later, the house still stands, empty and silent. People in town speak of it only in hushed tones, warning of the basement below, the place where shadows linger, where Grayson's evil waits, biding its time for another visitor to descend. The lingering curse. Though Sarah and James managed to escape the house, its influence followed them. Sarah started noticing strange occurrences at their new home. Faint whispers late at night, the sound of footsteps, and worst of all, shadows that seemed to move on their own. James, unaware of the horrors they'd faced in the basement, appeared unaffected. His memory had somehow been wiped clean, a side effect of whatever dark forces Sarah had summoned to banish Grayson. One night, as she lay awake, Sarah felt a cold breath on her neck. Turning over, she saw nothing but sensed an overwhelming presence, as if the shadows from the basement had latched onto her. They weren't gone, she realized. Grayson's curse had marked her, tethering her to the darkness she had awakened. Desperate for answers, Sarah retrieved Grayson's journal, the one relic she'd taken from the house. Many of the pages were damaged, torn and faded from the ritual, but some passages were still legible. As she read through it, one phrase stood out: "To end the curse, one must return to the origin." In the dim light, Sarah discovered a hidden compartment in the back of the journal. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman standing in front of the house, her face solemn, her eyes hauntingly familiar. Sarah realized the woman looked just like her, a distant relative perhaps, drawn to the same horrors that had nearly claimed her own life. Sarah's heart raced as she read the caption written on the back: The blood of the line binds us all to the basement. She now understood that her connection to the house ran deeper than she'd thought. This curse wasn't merely from disturbing Grayson's ritual. It was a family legacy, a cycle of haunting that had claimed many before her. The strange occurrences intensified. Doors in her house would creak open by themselves, revealing dark, cold spaces that seemed to lead nowhere. Lights would flicker, casting shadows that took on twisted shapes. In moments of silence, Sarah swore she could hear a faint, mocking laughter. Grayson's voice, still taunting her, challenging her to come back. James, oblivious to her torment, grew concerned. One evening he found her sitting in a dark room, whispering to herself, gripping Grayson's journal tightly. "Sarah, it's over," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We left that place. You need to let it go." But Sarah knew it wasn't over. The basement had a hold on her that distance couldn't break. Driven to the edge, Sarah finally made a decision. She couldn't live like this in fear of shadows, with a curse slowly eating away at her sanity. She had to confront it, once and for all. She returned to the house alone, slipping in through a broken window. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the walls groaning as if they remembered her. The basement door stood open, waiting, as though expecting her return. As she descended, her flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams on the walls. She reached the bottom, the shadows gathering around her like old friends. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She took out the journal and began reading aloud the final passages Grayson had written, a desperate attempt to close whatever portal he had opened. The room began to shake, dust falling from the ceiling, the air turning thick and oppressive. Shadows shifted, forming the face of Grayson, his eyes burning with anger and madness. "You think you can break the curse?" he sneered. "This house owns you now. You are part of it, bound by blood." Ignoring his taunts, Sarah completed the final words. Suddenly, the room filled with a brilliant, blinding light, searing through the shadows. Grayson's face twisted in agony, his figure disintegrating as the light washed over him. When the light faded, Sarah found herself standing in an empty basement, the shadows gone, the oppressive air replaced by silence. She felt a weight lift, as if the house had released her from its grasp. But as she turned to leave, she saw one last message scrawled on the wall in a handwriting eerily similar to her own. "The bloodline remains. One day, the basement will call you back." Sarah fled the house, her heart pounding. She left Grayson's journal behind, knowing that some mysteries are best left buried. But deep down, she knew the truth. The curse might be broken for now, but it would never truly disappear. Shadows never die. Years passed, and Sarah moved on with her life, starting a family of her own. She never spoke of the basement again. The memories locked away like secrets she couldn't bear to revisit. But every now and then she would notice her daughter staring at dark corners, her eyes following shadows that no one else could see. One evening, her daughter asked, "Mommy, who's the man in the basement?" Chills ran down Sarah's spine as she realized the curse had not ended. The house might have let her go, but it had already chosen its next victim. The basement of shadows would never die. It was only waiting, patiently, for the next generation to answer its call.